Well, Chris Turner, welcome to the Tell Me More podcast.
Glad to be here.
Yeah, it's all downhill from here, bro. I mean, this is like up there. There's like kids dream of NBA, astronaut. Tell Me More podcast. So don't be surprised if you deal with a little depression or quite a bit of come down after this.
It's an honor. I'm really looking forward to it.
So yeah, I get to play the kind of Casey's role this weekend and sort of facilitate and have a discussion with you, which I'm really looking forward to because one, well, I love the Book of Ruth, but two, I loved your sermon from this weekend, and we worked on it together.
Yep.
And so I'm excited to talk about kind of some of the ideas and things that we talked about. There's always so much more into a sermon than what you hear. There's all the stuff that goes on behind the scenes and all the things you wish you could have shared and yeah, just the different motives. So I hope to get into all of that. But before we jump into kind of what you talked about this weekend, maybe for people that might be listening today for like they didn't hear last week or whatever, kind of catch us up to speed. Where are we in the story of the Book of Ruth that you talked about this weekend?
Yeah, so we picked up in Ruth 1:19.
Okay.
And so this is Naomi getting back to Bethlehem. And man, like you said, when I first heard we were teaching the Book of Ruth, I probably had a lot of what maybe our listeners or anyone in our congregation would think of it. It's just more of this kind of romance story packed into the middle of the Old Testament. I had never really spent a lot of time studying it. And so it's been really interesting to dive in and just see these stories just have this timelessness about them that speak to us in just so many different phases of our life. And, you know, so you pick up where I picked up this week was Naomi just grieving to her fellow citizens, and once she's back in Bethlehem, and they're asking her, you know, hey, you know, is this Naomi? She's telling herself, no, I'm bitter, and it's because, and if you missed the first part, she's lost her husband in Moab.
And her sons,
which
is a huge deal in a patriarchal culture, and I don't mean that in a pejorative way. I just mean that the male, the head of the family, which would have been the male, was sort of the link to society, but also would serve as kind of like a police, hospital, law, judge, like that. Because there is no societal structure to hold, to care for displaced people, let's say. So if you're a widow and your husband's died and your sons have died, you really have nothing, no future, no hope. And honestly, you're quite vulnerable in the ancient world as a woman.
And that's sort of where Naomi, when we pick her up when she's back in Bethlehem, she's come back, but she also thinks her life is over. And
that's
she's
an important
sort of
detail.
Hit this wall, and she's, whether true or not, it's how she feels. And she feels not only does she feel her life is over, she feels like God has been completely against her.
So all right, so she's on the backside of loss.
Yes.
Important kind of detail. So she's lost and lost a lot. A lot of similarities, by the way. Have you thought about Job much? Very similar.
That was a rabbit trail. I went one version of the sermon I started going down because
like life just completely fell apart.
Everything
she was banking on, counting on, gone. And now really kind of feels like she has nothing, no hope. And she describes it in, well, if you got your Bible there, but let's look at it. So where did you begin? Verse 19?
Yeah, Ruth 1:19.
So the two of them, this is Naomi and Ruth. So Ruth, again, if you're new, Ruth is the daughter-in-law, and she's a Moabitess. So that means she's not part of the people of God. She's not. And that's really what the whole Old Testament story is charting or journeying with, is the people of God. So Ruth is this Moabitess, this foreigner, this outsider, has no covenant with Yahweh, is not part of God's people, has been intermarried with Naomi's sons, or one of her sons, but they're all dead, and so now it's these two women that remain. Okay, so the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. So this is where they're from. This is where Naomi's from. Bethlehem, you know, a little town of Bethlehem. This is a town in where is it, in Judah? Yeah, it is, because it's near, So, and so anyway, this is southern Israel, Judah. Northern part would have been Galilee, where Jesus is from. But he's born in Bethlehem. anyway, I digress. So they're journeying back to Bethlehem. Why, Chris? Why are they heading back to Bethlehem?
Yeah, so at this point, Naomi has heard when she's in the fields in Moab in 1:6, it tells us that God has visited his people. And so originally, like it's inferred that perhaps they left Bethlehem because there was a famine. We're not told that's exactly the reason, but it seems to be a logical conclusion that they leave Bethlehem because there's a famine in the land. They go to Moab.
Right.
And after all this death has happened, Naomi hears that God has visited his people. Basically, there's food available. And Naomi wants to arise and go back. She wants to leave her daughters-in-law behind. She kind of takes them for part of the journey, but then it gets to a point, it's like, don't come back with me.
Yeah.
And so we get them here arriving back in Bethlehem. And it's interesting why she didn't want her daughters-in-law to come back with her. Perhaps she was ashamed.
Yeah.
Perhaps she thought it could be...
Or maybe she's just thinking of them.
She thought they would be better off back in Moab.
Yeah.
And there's no one to marry because you're an outsider. And so there's all of those things.
You're not going to be treated well. Right. There's no future for you here. You might as well go back to your people and your gods.
That's right. And it's fascinating because she says the Lord took me away full and brought me back empty. She almost doesn't even acknowledge Ruth's existence to her people. I've come back empty-handed.
Right, she will.
Yeah.
Later, she says, you're worth more to me than 7 sons.
Yeah.
But now, doesn't feel that way. Wow. And there's so much in that, because that is like when you're in grief and loss, and we're going to talk about that, but that all the emotions, they don't all make sense, and they don't have to. But let's keep going. So the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them, rightfully so, right? Mm-hmm. It's not like people are passing through like this every day. And the women said, is this Naomi? Like, she's been gone for so long. But I love this. And you read this weekend. She said to them, don't call me Naomi, call me Mara. Okay, so you didn't. The service I was in, you didn't unpack that the name change.
Oh, did I not?
No, but maybe you did in the other services. So to talk a little bit about it.
Yeah, that was actually, I must have missed that in the 10:30. So the significance, Naomi's name means sweetness or pleasant.
Yeah.
And so she basically says, don't call me that anymore, call me Mara. So it's sort of, to me, this play on the fact that she left feeling sweet, feeling pleasant, because she was married and had 2 sons. You described the culture. In a good place. Now she's coming back and she's describing herself as, God has dealt bitterly with me.
Yeah, and that's what Mara means, is bitter.
Yes.
Yeah.
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 And she feels like her cup has been soured.
Empty.
Yeah.
For the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? I mean, you could just hear just the resentment, the frustration. It's more than frustration. It's a deep, I don't know what you'd call it. It's a loss, but there's more to it than that.
We talked about it this weekend as lament. She is lamenting about her situation to people. And I think, the way we defined it last week in our sermon prep is this is theologically incorrect, but emotionally true.
Okay, so hang on. I want to park on that for a second. Theologically incorrect, but emotionally true. We have a really hard time with this. This feels to a lot of people, like especially Western people, because we're a people of ideas, I think more than emotions, right? We think that thinking correctly about God, and it is really important to think correctly about God, and so we want to have good theology. So this isn't a case for having bad theology, but there is this biblical pattern of, allergies. There is this biblical pattern of different characters, stories you read down through Scripture, when faced with really terrible situations, they cry out to God in a way that isn't exactly theologically accurate, but what you're saying is emotionally true. So we're not to read this and say, because literally what Naomi is saying here when she says, I went away full, or the Lord has dealt very bitterly with me. When I went away full, and the Lord brought me back empty. He's testified against me. Robert Alter, Old Testament scholar, talks about this passage, says that the language used here is that Naomi is describing God has attacked her like a wild animal.
Yeah.
It reminds me of Job as well, because Job really takes God to task for everything that he's gone through, and then I don't think and then Yeah, and then you read through Job, and God, when he finally does answer, doesn't say, here's why. He just says, where were you when I created the universe?
Yeah, Job's got all these questions, and God shows up and suddenly can't say anything.
Yeah. So we're seeing some of that here. Talk about it just a little bit.
Yeah, I think you mentioned just culturally, sometimes I think we struggle to, I think maybe to back up, I think a lot of it has to do with what we conceive of as faith to begin with. And I think I didn't get into this a ton, but I think if we only think of faith as correct thoughts or the way we think about things.
Or speaking God's word.
Yes, or a viewpoint. So there's really no allowance for emotion in that because we miss that we're in relationship with a person. We really make God very impersonal when we only think it's about understanding and intellectually ascending to a doctrine. And it's so much more than that. I think Naomi, Job, Jesus, when he's in the garden, understands that these are people that understand they're in relationship with a person. Yeah. And so they're willing.
So they cry out and say things. Maybe the kind of penultimate example of this is Jesus on the cross.
Yes.
Quoting Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me? And if you read all of Psalm 22, he's obviously, this is the beginning of Psalm 22, but then you read deeper into Psalm 22 and you find out that no, God hasn't forsaken. In fact, that's how Psalm 22, I feel forsaken, abandoned. Then you come to the end. It's like, I'm not abandoned. You've, and I forget the wording of it. I have to look it up, but it's essentially, God, you've been there for me.
Yeah.
And that's what's happening here is like, that is lament. This is what it feels like right now.
Yep.
You've abandoned me.
Yep.
And I think that's what we want in relationship. That's what you're talking about, is that this is relational language because this is how we talk in relationship.
100%. I think, to think about the Psalms, I remember the first small group I was in with Pastor Blake, who's been on here before. And I remember saying in that group, I hate the Psalms. And it was like, for me, it was at that point in my life, just because so many of the Psalms start with this, what is, to me at that point felt like whining or complaining.
Wow.
And I just remember not being emotionally healthy enough to really understand what's going on within the heart of these writers, and specifically David and most of them. It's interesting what Psalms of lament, any lamenting does. It starts with what feels like complaining, but ends up turning back to the Lord with a hopeful tone. That's what I think is fascinating about Naomi. The next time we see her talk, like of significance, she is proclaiming that the Lord has not forsaken the living or the dead.
Isn't that amazing?
Like, it's amazing. Like, the whole narrative right after this lament shifts into this hopeful tone. And I tried to, in each of the services, kind of illustrate for people. It's like when music changes in a movie, where you kind of feel it start to pick up.
Right.
As soon as this happens, it's like things start to change.
That's really cool. So the idea is that within relationship, we would be able to trust the other, in this case, God, with the deepest, our most personal, but also some of our most ugly feelings, even about them.
Yeah.
And I think that's what, if you really stop and think about it, like you relationally, this is what we all want with a husband, a wife, with children, friends. We want the people that we're closest to feel comfortable and safe enough to entrust to us the questions and the feelings and even the doubts that they may be. I mean, far more dangerous is to feel it all and feel it deeply and say nothing, right? I would rather my wife come to me and say, I'm really angry with you, and lay out why, and me to be able to, like us to be able to work through it, than just to hold all of that in. And I think like life is such, and what I love about the Bible is it doesn't ignore it.
No.
It doesn't avoid the idea that there's really difficult, like not only things we face, but questions about why the nature of evil, why we experience some of the things, why some people experience such hardship and others don't, and why it doesn't seem to be like equal or measured out according to the way that someone's lived their life. It's like the good people sometimes get the worst of it.
Right.
And the scripture doesn't shy away from it. It doesn't try to hide that or obscure that fact. What it does show in the case of Naomi, in the case of Job, and even in the case of Jesus, you have righteous people suffering unjustly and wrestling with the emotions of all of that.
What I've found, just in my own journey and dealing with, and I talked about it this weekend, loss of my mom at a relatively young age. I think we want to know why.
Yeah.
Why did these things happen in the first place? But it's a question the Bible just seems uninterested in answering for us. And we're not told why evil exists.
Right.
We're not told, even when God created Adam and Eve in the garden, yet here is...
It just assumes the snake.
Just assumes
it's
there.
Like, where did it come from?
He
doesn't even bother to say.
Profoundly uninterested in answering that question for us.
Wow.
And it's the question that the biblical characters, and especially you see this in the Psalms, tend to ask is, how long, O Lord?
Isn't that fascinating that we particularly, and I don't know if you have an answer for why this is, we want to know why. They don't really ever seem to ask why.
There's two good books on this. One, Problem of Pain by C.S. Lewis, really helped me through that season. And then another really good book that I read later, just about a year or two ago, was The God I Don't Understand by Christopher Wright. Because the things that I think people of faith and we as Christians sort of confront is, we believe on one hand and know on one hand that God is a good, omnipotent God, but he also is allowing this evil and suffering to happen. So really, I think people outside the Christian faith, this is one of the arguments that I think C.S. Lewis is making, is like, people outside the Christian faith look at this injustice of the world and they don't struggle necessarily to put it into terms as much as we do. And it's because it doesn't seem to align with who we know God to be. And so for us, and maybe again, because we're uncomfortable with that nuance of God being all-knowing, all-powerful, but also the real relevance of evil and suffering. And how do those two things reconcile? And so I think that's where a lot of people, myself included, can get off on their journey of faith and start to question, man, is there a God at all?
Right. Yes. So Naomi here is bringing her feelings, uncomfortable though they may be, inaccurate though they may be. She's entrusting them to the Lord. Kind of maybe, so for your sermon, the outline was Naomi's trust, Ruth's initiative, God's grace. So when you're talking about, is this what you mean when you're talking about Naomi's trust, is bringing kind of your whole self and maybe even processing through, and this might take some time, right, with the Lord, but that you're processing through. Is this kind of the idea of wrestling with God that you're talking about? Yeah,
absolutely, because I think what Naomi does well is she's willing to get near to the person she blames.
Yes.
And I think that's is
such
key.
A great idea.
Like she starts to move towards God in 1 verse 6. She feels all of this. She doesn't suddenly discover these feelings when she gets to Bethlehem. She thinks God has judged her. He's testified against her, but she's willing to get close to him. And I think one of the points I really wanted to drive home this past weekend is the idea that you can wrestle with God about the way you feel and the way you think and the way you're processing things. The example I used this weekend was my 2-year-old son. He loves to wrestle. As soon as I get home, every single night, he wants to roughhouse. He's a 2-year-old boy. It's great. And on the weekends, he's always wrestling with Pastor Lee and pummeling him before services during our rehearsals. But there's joy in him because he knows he can just kind of be rough and he's not going to really harm us.
Yeah.
He's not going to really be able to significantly hurt us.
Yeah.
I think the same is true with God.
Yeah, I love that.
There are things that absolutely grieve the Holy Spirit, but you wrestling with him on the way you feel about how life is going for you is not one of them.
So this was a key thought that when we were talking earlier last week in preparation for your sermon that I was thinking of, is this idea of the proximity of relationship, or the closeness of relationship, is what determines how the feelings or the expression of pain will be received, right? So there's a difference, in other words, between wrestling with God and critiquing God.
Yeah, that's good.
So critique, and it has everything to do with the distance that you're at from God.
Yeah.
Right? So a critic is someone who stands at a distance and attacks. not because they don't want deeper relationship. They want to destroy. We want our words to tear down. That's what a critic does. They're not involved in it. They just stand at a distance and criticize. What makes Naomi different here, and I love it, is that the critique of God, if you will, or her words, her harsh words about God, her inaccurate words about God, come only after she has returned to Bethlehem. And you said it a minute ago. It's like getting close to the one that hurt you.
Yeah.
And I think that's a huge thing for a lot of people, because this is what happens. Pain, loss, disappointment leads to distance, bitterness. It
100%.
drives a wedge. There was, we heard this weekend from different folks who were showing up who were responding to the message that it's like they suffered loss, and it caused a rift in their relationship with God, and have been at odds with Him, at a distance from Him for a long, long time, because of these feelings that they have, not knowing that they're meant to bring the pain of all of that in, and even in some sense, what is it called? A theodicy. It's where you're putting God on trial. That's what Job does. He puts God on trial, and God isn't angry with him for it.
Yeah, God seems to, in Job's case, let all of that play out and then show up and kind of remind Job of who God is in that story. You know, in this story, it's fascinating. God really demonstrates His faithfulness to Naomi through Ruth and later Boaz. And I think there's just something significant about, when you're entrusting your heart to someone.
Yes.
Naomi is willing to do that even though she feels like God has broken it. She continues.
Yes.
And this is where I think, and this is why every commentary is ambivalent towards Naomi, because they have mixed feelings. Like they have these mixed feelings around her theology, but also they marvel that she's willing to grieve and move towards God nonetheless. And I think what's significant about that and is the idea of submitting yourself to someone. Because you're talking about the idea of your entrusting your pain to someone.
Yes.
When you're in relationship with a person, this happens all the time. We're oftentimes say we have conflicts at work, we have conflict in our marriage, disagreements. Instead of leaning into that, the human tendency is to separate.
It's just to separate. Well, that's uncomfortable. That's ugly.
Yep.
They wouldn't want to hear that. I don't want to be rude.
No.
This is at the heart of so much unhealth in relationships, is our willingness to submit to one another what's really going on and how we feel.
That's right.
Yeah, not airing every thought that comes through your head, but being willing to trust each other with the big feelings. And I think especially people we say we're in deep, close relationship with, it's like being able to sit down and say, hey, this is tough.
Yes.
I need to talk to you about this. I trust you enough. I want to share with you how I'm feeling. And that's what you're saying Naomi is doing.
Yeah, because I think it's amazing once we do that, we actually feel more loyal to the person that we're following. This happens in work. As I work for you, I've seen that play out a number of times over the last 5-6 years. Right. I think there's, we often think of the word submission as compliance. And I don't think that's the biblical view of submission. Compliance is this idea, just kind of do what you're told, smile about it, don't have an opinion, don't have thoughts, don't have a way of thinking about things. But the biblical picture, and you see it with Jesus, is submission.
So I'm going to use an example here. It's a little weird.
Yeah.
But I think it's a good example because it does illustrate. It's like, I think we can see probably from movies or maybe even from experience or whatever, two lovers quarreling intensely with each other. Only that quarrel then leads back into intimate relations, right? It's like it turns into because there's a cultural term for this, but yeah, it's like I think we understand that that's a real thing. It's a real thing. It's like when there's this intense emotion poured out towards someone that we love, even when it's ugly, it does often tend to deepen, strengthen the bond between two people.
Yep. You go through a difficult conversation with your spouse.
You come out feeling more aligned or closer on the other side of it.
You're willing to go through those difficult conversations. I remember, working for you in 2020, we had a very tense meeting, and it was, you probably could have said, hey, it might be time for Chris to work somewhere else. But I think what I came out of that going, man, I really want to help him.
Yeah.
Like there's things that were, I feel like I could really serve you well. And it was like I came out of there going, hey, like you have my full
But
loyalty.
It was because we were willing to walk through that you could share and took the risk and shared some uncomfortable things with me. And I didn't respond in insecurity, which would be to basically put you away because you've said that.
Right.
So I think a great thing for anyone that's listening is to consider that God won't shun you for sharing.
That's right.
The hardest and darkest parts of your, like, I may not believe in you. I don't know that you're good.
No.
All of these types of things, like that kind of stuff.
I think so many people, you see Moses do this a couple of times. You see David do this in the Psalms. People appeal to God based on his character all the time. Mm-hmm. And it's like there's times in life where things don't necessarily seem to line up with who we know God to be.
Yep.
And that's sort of what I think is happening here in this story is just there's this, hey, God, what's up with this?
Yeah.
And like we've mentioned with any other relationship, we regularly remind, what I'm trying to remind my kids of is like not to do certain things based on who they are.
Yeah.
And it's like, this is the same. It's not that we're correcting God, but there's sometimes things that feel to us that this doesn't line up with who you said to be.
Right.
This doesn't line up with who I know you to be.
Right.
And what's amazing in stories like that is when people do that, God tends to show himself faithful.
He does. He does. All right. So Naomi's trust. She's entrusting, and sometimes that's all you can do. In fact, I think especially when you're in deep grief,
yes,
all you can do, all you can even imagine doing is just returning to the Lord and trusting him with all right, I'm going to show up one more time. I'm going to go back to church. I'm going to go forward for prayer. I'm going to sit down with the pastor. Like that might seem like crossing the Grand Canyon to you in that moment. And maybe you can't even fathom, and I think that's what's happening with Naomi is you can't even fathom that there's like anything good could be possible. And that's not even on your mind. It wouldn't even be why you're doing it. You're just showing up to kind of bring this burden that you've been carrying. But that's step one, is trusting the Lord with that. Love that. All right, now number two is Ruth's initiative. So this is this idea, and I want you to unpack this a little bit. We can talk about it together. But let's just start in chapter 2. Now, Naomi, this is a detail that the author is providing, not incidental, by the way. Mm-hmm. Now, Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, meaning this is Naomi's husband who's passed away, Elimelech is. His name is Boaz. So this is really important because the family connections are how you would be redeemed, if you will, how someone who has suffered, again, like I said, the patriarch's responsibility. We have all this, obviously with the term patriarch, patriarchy, all these types of things has such a negative connotation. But in those days, the patriarch's job was to care for the family,
right,
whatever that meant. That's where we're going to see in this story is that Boaz is going to step up and care for Naomi through Ruth. The story is not Boaz, even though there may be some indications that Ruth was attractive. It's not Boaz marrying or pursuing Ruth for romantic or lustful desires,
right,
but rather fulfilling his responsibility to care for the people who have been entrusted to him, who are under his care. So so the author is sort of establishing Boaz's character right here, but we're not going to get into Boaz too much. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, so I underline this because I think it's important. So Naomi's done what she can do, which is all she could do was just get back to Bethlehem and pour out the bitterness of her heart to God. That's all she could do. That was all she needed to do. Now it's Ruth here, her turn. She said to Naomi, let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I shall find favor. And Naomi's response is, go, my daughter. So she said, so it's Ruth who's taking the initiative saying, let me go do this.
Yeah.
So she's able to go, and I love this. So there's a word in here about community as well, especially when you're grieving. There's sometimes relationships you need near you for someone who can go further than what you're emotionally capable of going right now. Naomi had gone as far as she could go.
Yeah.
Now it's Ruth's turn to say, let me go. And you might go, but isn't Ruth grieving herself? Yeah, maybe, but also Ruth's probably really young.
Mm-hmm.
And who knows where her relationship with her husband was at? There may not have been a ton of lost affection for this husband. I'm sure there's feelings and emotions that go along with it, but she's in a wildly different place than where Naomi's at. And so able to kind of do a little bit more. And here what we see is her taking initiative. And this opens up this whole idea, which I think is a massive biblical principle, of sort of God's partnership with us, that God acts, but also we act. And often I think God is waiting for us to act so that he can begin to work with us. It's this idea of partnership.
Yeah, I think what Ruth does here is amazing. She does kind of say okay, I've got it from here type of thing. And it's just remarkable faith. She's an outsider, and yet she's willing and determined to get to work in the land where God is. And I think, to your point, there's only two things that are directly attributed to God in the entire book. One of those is in 1:6, and that's God giving food. The other is in 4:13, and that's God giving Ruth a baby.
Yeah.
Everything else God's doing is much more subtle.
I love it.
And I think
behind the scenes,
he's sort of
and it almost feels like Ruth's actions.
Yep.
She's not manipulating. There's this beautiful dance or interplay throughout this text of the providential, like I said. Now Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man. Later, there's this great line that says she happened to come to the part of the field that belonged to Boaz. That is not accidental language. No. She happened to come. I think if you're telling this story, a few thousand years ago, it's clear through your tone of voice. There's almost like a wink, wink. Yeah. She happened to come. Yeah. We all know what's happening here. And the question is, who did this? Was it Ruth? Did she happen to come? I think we've been here before.
So yeah, she's just kind of,
you could totally see this. I happened to be over here, or was it God's providential hand? And she really truly did happen to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, not knowing that it belonged to Boaz. I think the answer is really not important.
No. One of the commentaries put this whole section, summed it up really well. I thought, I can't remember exactly which one it was, but said the prayer unuttered is going to be answered. Wow. And so it's Naomi, it doesn't necessarily pray, but Ruth faithfully saying, I will go to a field and find favor.
Wow.
And as that's a faith statement. I'm going to go here. I will find favor.
Well, it is this
God
aggressiveness.
Guides her.
Yeah,
yes.
that God, I think, rewards.
Yes.
I talked about this in week 1 a little bit, but it's this Yiddish term, chutzpah, that we're familiar with, this kind of daring, bold. I think that's what you would call faith. And I think that's what Jesus in Matthew 8 is rewarding with the Roman centurion who just has the gall to ask Jesus to come heal his servant, and not only to come heal, but to just speak the word.
Yeah.
He's blown away at the daring, at just the courage to ask, the presumption, let's say, to ask such a thing. And I think God strangely really likes that kind of presumption. I mean that in a positive way. Just like the woman with the issue of blood. If I just touch the hem of his garment, he'll heal me. I'm going to take this chance. And it almost feels, if you're reading the story of the woman with the issue of blood, that like she's presuming, she's sort of kind of forcing her agenda on Jesus. Doesn't ask him.
Right.
Like, isn't forthright. Doesn't come forward and say, would you heal me? Just goes in and touches the edge of his garment. Yeah. And Jesus, so it's almost this violation.
Yeah.
But he doesn't mind. He's not mad about it. He's like, who did this? And when she kind of sheepishly comes forward, he's like, way to go.
Right.
God
seems to have this way of meeting us where we are in our faith. And the lady or the woman who reaches out and touches his garment, like that is her faith. She has said to herself, if I just touch his garment, and the centurion just says, I know that you can do this if you just speak it. Or the woman who's like, even we eat the crumbs that fall, like even dogs can eat the crumbs that fall from the master. Yes. So there's all of the examples. And I think this is what is also remarkable about Ruth, and it comes a few verses later. She recognizes in her mind, she's undeserving.
Yeah.
She's like, I'm not worthy of this. And she has this proper posture that you also see with the Syrophoenician woman is, hey, I know I don't deserve this, but I want to receive it nonetheless.
So there's this statement I've heard many times we think is a verse, it's not a verse, which is God helps those who help themselves.
Yeah.
But principally that seems to be the truth here.
Right.
Right? That the Lord is helping Ruth, but Ruth is helping Ruth too.
Yes.
And she's working in concert. So it's not this self-centered thing, but it is this determination to move forward, doing what she can do in the whatever little she can do to maybe open up the possibility that God could bless what I'm doing.
Yeah, I think it's right? two key things in that is that she's first in a place God can bless, and then she gets to work.
Okay, talk about that first one. What do you mean by that?
I think, we see in the beginning pages of Scripture, or at least at this time, maybe to give some more context, there were gods of lands.
Yeah.
And so, at least in the way the people thought, Chemosh was the god of Moab.
Right.
And so Yahweh is the God of Israel.
Yeah.
And so all these different places have different gods.
So if you want to go where you got to get to where that God
exactly,
like they're tribal gods. They rule over a certain. Now Israel thought their God was God over all.
Yep.
But she doesn't know this exactly. Doesn't. This is not how. So you're saying returning to the land and getting there is kind of a key thing that God is using. This is not to say that God only works in certain geographical places.
No, that's not the idea. Yeah.
But it is, I think, very much the idea that God does work through in specific times and in specific ways and in specific places through specific people, because something is happening there.
Yes.
And if I want to experience some of that, I need to get to there. This doesn't mean I want to be careful, because what we don't want to send people packing up, driving all over the country chasing whatever move of God or revival that they hear about. But there is very much this idea that God does send us to places and says, that's where this is the place I have for you. I'm going to bless you here.
100%. You see it with Abraham. It's like, hey, I'm calling you out of this land. This is a place I'm going to bless you.
Right.
He does it with the children of Israel out of Egypt to a land. And I think what happens is, I think the application for us as followers of Jesus is to ask ourselves regularly, like, am I in the place God is blessing?
Yes.
Am I in an environment God is blessing? And this could be true of a church, it could be true of your job, it could be true of relationships you might find yourself in, but am I in an environment that God is blessing?
Wow.
And does it, and it's less about the geographical place, does the way that I'm living my life align with God himself?
Yeah.
And so Ruth has done that first, and then she gets moving. Boaz doesn't get dropped off at her front door when she gets to Bethlehem.
Yeah, so maybe what you're saying then, this is there's a difference between this and just the kind of secular idea of hustle.
Right. It's not just her work ethic that makes this happen.
Yes.
It's
the
harmony of both God working and Ruth working that I think is God's intent from the beginning. Working with man in partnership.
So there's this, and I think, so what's the difference between hard work, hustle, and what we're talking about, which is, I think it's this submission to God, because previous to this, so Ruth is not just out there, grinding, working real hard, that description comes after this, my God, your God will be my God, your people, my people.
Right.
Where you die, I will die. This deep commitment to Naomi, but to the people of God.
That's right.
And to God himself. So she's made this submissive commitment where she's bound herself to God. And then within the confines of this now new relationship with God and through his people, she's doing what she knows to do. And I think that has all sorts of implications for the everyday Christ follower, which is within the confines of your relationship with God, Is there something that God is asking you to do? Is there something that God has put into your hand that you could do something with? To give God something to bless. My dad always used to say that God blesses the work of your hands.
Yes.
But if your hands aren't doing anything, God has nothing to bless.
Yeah, in fact, he'll just let you sit there. And he does it time and time and time again. And I gave a couple examples this weekend, but it's Abraham's father getting to the town of Haran. He settles there. The next verse, he dies.
Well, okay, so there's real context to that. So Abraham's father, so Abraham's this guy who has all this, is the one who's like Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. But his father, this strange detail in Genesis, it says his father set out from, so his father Terah sets out from Haran, and gets to Haran.
Yes.
But he sets out from to go to Canaan.
Yeah, it says that Terah set out to
He's
go
going
to the
land that God is going to give Abram. But then he doesn't get there because he stops in Haran. Interestingly, the name of his son who dies.
Yeah,
he just stops there.
Weird detail. He witnesses his son dying. And so, I don't know, these are logical leaps, but you can just start to infer that maybe he gets to this town, he settles, he's
very similar to the story of Ruth, isn't it?
And it's just like there's over and over, but this is Elimelech at the beginning. He goes to visit Moab. He remains there.
Yeah.
He remains outside of the place God's called him. And I think that's like it's harsh, but God will let the people of Israel settle outside the place he's called them, and then he lets them die.
He does. He'll just let
over and over.
Exactly.
Like God will not push us for whatever reason, but he does seem to steer us when we're moving towards him.
Wow. That's a profound idea. So what you're saying is God isn't going to do for you what you can and should do for yourself.
Yes. A.W. Tozer said, God never does for us that which he can delegate to man. God never does for himself that which he can delegate to man. He just chooses from the beginning. He doesn't need us, but yet he chooses to work through us.
So God is not this helicopter parent showing up in every situation that you get yourself into, making sure that you can't fail. Neither is he harsh, and that he's standing off at a distance with a scowl and skeptical and arms crossed. But he really has, honestly, it's honoring, it's dignifying that you have the agency, that God would respect your boundaries to such a degree that he's not going to intervene in your situation unless you actively want him to or moving toward it. And so Ruth is doing what she knows to do.
Yes.
What again, and I think this is an ongoing kind of theme through Scripture, which is this idea that God often puts steps in front of us that don't seem that significant, but nothing's going to happen until we're willing to take the step. The story of Naaman is one of my favorite examples of this. This Syrian general who has an Israelite slave, which is totally the way that this would work. You conquer, you take slaves. So he's got this Israelite girl who's a slave. She's in his house. He now has leprosy. She's like, hey, it's amazing all the power dynamics that are at play here that are really an affront to our modern sensibilities. She's a slave in his house.
Yeah.
And yet she's the one responsible for talking about the prophet that could get him healed. That's really, really remarkable. She's not sitting back going, good, now you die, you pig. You took, whatever. Right. It's like crazy. So he goes back to find, who is it? Is it Elijah?
I think it's Elisha.
Gehazi. Yeah. So she goes back. So they go to Elisha's dwelling, wherever this is. And Elisha doesn't even bother to come out, sends his servant out. It's just like, hey, go dip in the River Jordan 7 times, you'll be healed. And he's like, no, I'm not going to do it.
Yeah.
That's disgusting. I've been to the Jordan River, and it is not the kind of people get baptized there. I didn't want to get in that dirty water.
It's not appealing. Yeah.
So it's not like a beautiful, cool, clear mountain stream.
Yeah.
He's like, look, there's all these other rivers that are around here that are so much nicer. And his servants rightfully tell him if he had asked you to do something hard, wouldn't you have done it? Just do this.
Mm-hmm.
And so he has to bury his pride or swallow it and go dip in the Jordan. Of course, the rest of the story is he's healed. But that small obedience is the starting point for God's partnership? Are you willing to do the small thing that is available to you to do?
God routinely just seems to put those little tests in front of us. And I think we miss them because we're looking for something a little, like you're saying, a little more challenging, like Naaman, or we want something a little grander to go after. Yeah. And that's what Jesus says, like, he who is faithful in little will be faithful in much.
All right, Pastoral, I want to ask you, because you deal with, like, you interact with congregants even more so than I do. Give some examples. What could this look like in the kind of the relationships that you see and you get to be a part of? Like, where do you see small steps of faithfulness that people could take that shows initiative? You got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, the first thing that comes to mind is, a lot of people go through marriage problems.
Yeah.
And they're unwilling until things get to a point of crisis.
Yeah.
To admit they need some help.
Yeah.
And maybe it's embarrassing to us. We don't want to go to counseling. We don't want to sit down with a pastor and really admit that things aren't as good as we would hope they are. And what a simple act of going and sitting down with, whether it's a pastor or a counselor, and working on this relationship.
I have financial trouble. I have a gambling addiction.
Yes.
I struggle with pornography. I mean, what's interesting, like, at Church on the Move, the resources are available.
Yes.
There's a Catharos group for men, particularly who are struggling with sexual addiction, pornography addiction. Can you bring yourself to sign up?
And the Naaman example is great because oftentimes the steps God puts in front of us feel embarrassing to us.
Yes.
And so Catharos a good example, or any of these other steps. It's like, I don't want to admit I'm a follower of Jesus. I don't want to admit that I'm not perfect. That's often what it comes down to for people.
I just wouldn't. What would other people think of me?
Yeah.
I could see this happening with simple acts of obedience, and these are kind of common church things. I'm sure that there could be any number of a little bit more personalized, but someone serving somewhere feels beneath them, waiting to be asked to, maybe the desire is to make a kingdom impact.
Yes,
and maybe you're praying, God, help me make a kingdom impact, but you're passing up the very basic opportunity. You're not out gleaning in the field.
Right.
You're not in a position where where God could start to use you. You're sitting back waiting for God to open up some big magical door where you're in charge of some massive ministry. It's not going to happen. Start where you can.
And I think that's a good word, because I think what we're really wanting to do is use the place to accomplish what we want, as opposed to really being submitted to. It's like, I'm submitted to this, and I'm going to trust that God will take care of me in the process.
Right.
And so to go serve in maybe an area that you might think is really low down, you're practicing submission. I'm putting myself there. I'm submitted to this place. And what tends to happen is the people that do that end up with a lot of influence over time.
It's like the guy who's been unemployed for 5 years is holding out for upper management position.
Right.
It's like, come on, bro. Start where you can.
Yes. Get a job.
Let's just begin there.
Yep.
Yeah. So I could see another one being something to do with financially. Giving.
Yes.
I don't feel like what I'm going to give is all that much, or what difference will it make
and that
in the
stops
face of...
so many people in conversations. I don't want to give because I don't feel like it's going to make that big of an impact. It has nothing to do with this. Like, we're not churches, and especially, our hope is not, oh, you need to give a certain amount. No. What we hope is what happens in you.
Yeah.
Like, at the end of the day, this is not about us. It's about what we want and the people we shepherd and lead. And there's a opportunity when you start trusting the Lord financially that He's going to take care of you.
So gleaning in the field could look like serving, giving, the admission of brokenness in your life, or things that need to change, or showing up to a small group, or going to marriage counseling, or whatever. These are all different ways we, like Ruth, can glean in a field, which allows God's providential hand to then start working on our behalf, to where it's like, maybe through one of those actions, you meet somebody, a friendship forms, an insight develops, something, and you come to the other side of it, you go, oh, wow, I never would have gotten here apart from doing this this simple thing that God's asked me to do.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's Ruth is taking initiative. She's doing what she can with what she has, and God is just blessing that big time.
And I think it's true. You taught this in the Proverbs series last summer, trust in the Lord with all your heart.
Yeah.
Lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge Him. And He's sort of I like the way we talked about it, straightens out your path.
Yeah, I like
It's
that.
the
He
way,
makes
it's
it
what
so
he
all
does.
the crooked,
And that's what he's doing with Ruth. Ruth is
yeah.
moving. I'm going to go find favor. And he's like, I'm going to make sure you end up where you need to.
Yes.
He's working subtly. Like, I think this is
like
true.
like a conductor orchestrating all of it. I think, what is the works all things together for the good of this? Is Romans 8?
Yeah.
Yeah, or no, maybe it's not, but or maybe it is. I don't know.
He works out.
It is? Okay.
He works out all things for good for those who love him.
Yeah.
And I think there's a truth to that, because there's a, I said it in one of the services this weekend, you didn't just happen to run into that work contact
Yeah.
that God used to open up a door for you. Like, you may think it's a coincidence. I think God has a lot more divine appointments for us than we realize.
You know what and you know where you see what's so cool about what you're saying, exactly that idea here, is that shows up because Ruth is in the lineage of Christ.
Yes.
So is Rahab. So is Tamar. These are all three less than ideal circumstances. Ruth wasn't even supposed to be a part of the people of God.
Nope.
She's a Moabitess. She has no covenant. Elimelech was. So what's amazing about God is two things can be true. It can be both a mistake for Elimelech to go to Moab in the first place, and he can use that so that
so
Ruth
true.
becomes part of the family lineage of Jesus. Same with Rahab, a prostitute. So there's all these like less than ideal circumstances. Well, that Solomon comes from the adulterous affair of David and Bathsheba,
Yes.
and ends up blessing Israel quite to quite a large degree. Is the goodness of God to work things out for His people, even when our motives are not pure, even when we're when we're crooked in so many different ways. That's what I love, is that when you're willing to just give God a little bit, He can straighten out so much. And you will find yourself saying at a certain point in your life, it's a tragedy that I went through that, or I regret having made that decision. And yet,
Yes.
who would I be? Where would I be if not having, walked through that?
Yes.
And so, anyway, I think that's a beautiful part of the story of Ruth. All right, ending. You ended with God's grace, and that's a bit of what we're talking about right now. Is that God, when you trust Him, and you give Him something to work with, He then starts to begin to lavish grace upon you. Talk about that for a minute.
Yeah, for me, I think when you and I, especially in message prep, it's so easy for Ephesians 2 to just quickly come to mind.
Yes,
because she's like God's grace in this story is most often demonstrated through Boaz, and we're going to see that in the coming weeks when we talk about Boaz more this next weekend. But Boaz really is in this situation God to Ruth in the way he's treating her. I mean, she's submitted herself to him. She's working in his field, and he's telling her, hey, don't leave. Like, stay here. This is a place of favor for you. And then he just says these really profound things, and he pronounces essentially a blessing on her. And this is in verse 12. It says, the Lord repay you for what you have done. And this is for her loyalty to Naomi.
Right.
When it would have made more sense for her to go back to Moab, that's the more likely opportunity for her to get married, for her to have kids, which at that time, as you've said, was your source of provision. Would have been easier to do that. And it says, a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. And then she talks about how she has found favor. I think that statement there by Boaz is really significant, because Ruth in verse 10 and 11 has thrown herself down and is like, why are you treating me this way? I'm undeserving.
Yeah.
She has the heart that Jesus looks at in the New Testament. It's like, Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner.
Yes.
Not the one who's like, thank you, God, I'm not like this person.
So she rightfully identifies that she really has no basis on which to ask.
Yes.
That's, again, what you see, what we're talking about with the Syrophoenician woman asking for the Lord to heal. Was it a child or a servant or something? I think it's probably a child. And he says, it's not right for me to take the food belonging to the children and give it to the dogs. Yeah, but even the dogs get, like, she dares to ask, though she really has no right or basis to ask. And that's what you see with Ruth. She's approached on that sort of daring faith kind of posture. And the Lord, through Boaz, is responding to her. But she's recognizing that I really have no relational grounds. I'm a foreigner. There's no reason you should treat me kindly. These people have been dealing with famine on their own.
Right.
Why would I bring in this foreign woman here but then that is the God that they serve, a God who's told them, hey, be kind to the foreigner.
Yep.
Leave the fields, like don't glean your fields, leave those for the poor and the widows and so forth, so they'll have something.
Right.
So this is God's character and nature, and she's experiencing that through the kindness of Boaz. But you're right, it ties into Ephesians 2, because this is not just the story of Ruth, it's the story of us.
Yes, that's what was the way I wanted to end this weekend, is we should see ourselves in the story of Ruth.
Yeah.
There's just, man, the undeserving foreigner, the people that
you were outside the covenant.
We were outside the covenant. And because of the blood of Christ, Paul used that language, you've been brought near.
Yes.
And I think that's the invitation to us in this story, is that really from the beginning pages of Scripture, God has always been open to people that will draw near to him.
Wow.
And that's exactly what Ruth does here. And God's grace is lavished on her, and his favor is poured out on her. And I think the same opportunity is true for us, because what I think is beautiful, whether it's Rahab you mentioned, whether it's Ruth, is that God is always looking to make room for people inside of his family, inside his home, inside the place where he dwells.
Even really messed up people.
That's right.
People who have made mistakes, people who the wreckage of their life is primarily down to their own poor decisions. We see this in the story of the prodigal son, who has made ruin of his life and determines, I love this, determines to come back.
Yeah.
Determines to return, if only on the basis of a slave. I'll just be a slave. But even the slaves in my father's house are treated better than what I'm dealing with here. Doesn't anticipate that when he returns, he'll be treated as a celebrated son.
Yes.
And that is the grace of God.
Yes.
That all we, like sheep, have gone astray. I think it's Isaiah that says this. But that God has laid upon him the iniquity of it, Jesus, the iniquity of us all. And so when we return to the Father, we don't get what we deserve. Jesus got what we deserve.
Yep.
We get what he deserves, which is we get treated like the royal son returning home, because this is the grace of God.
And I think the final kind of piece of this is God's warning, to use the prodigal son example, is God's warning to us as people of God to not forget where it is we came from.
Yeah.
It's amazing how Paul starts that passage in Ephesians, is therefore remember.
Yeah.
Like, be reminded that you were once outside. And in the prodigal son,
Strangers
the older
to the
brother that
covenants of
just
promise.
forgets, like, man, can
kidding.
we lose sight of, we can get so familiar with it.
Yeah.
So much of this story, I think, of Ruth is also sort of a warning to Israel. Even these outsiders will draw near to me, and you're not. And we see that later with the story of Jonah as well. It's like, man, you've got this guy who's fired up.
Wow.
That he's fired up for God in some ways, but he's also mad that he's forgiving all these outside the covenant.
You know what
people.
I'm wondering, Chris? There's, when I think about Job, when Job is putting God on trial and God finally shows up, it's almost as if the Lord is saying to him, not just who are you, but did you think I owed you something different than this?
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the harsh truths that Christians really don't want to face, you hear this statements like this thrown out in culture, but even Christians will say them, everybody deserves a second chance.
Mm-hmm.
Really? Why? Who said? Where did you get that idea? Well, everybody deserves a shot at forgiveness. Do they? You may want that, but should? Who are you to set the rules?
Right.
And where does this come from? And I think every now and like in Job's story, God is gracious to Job in the end. But there is this reminder that he owes you nothing. And when the prodigal son returns, same with Ruth. I think they've got it right. Point is, I think they understand I don't deserve anything. They remember who they are.
Yes.
That they offer nothing and they're bringing nothing and they have no right to make a demand. But they're just boldly showing up asking. And of course, God in his grace responds to them, even with Job, who is this, willing to take all of these harsh feelings that he has toward the Lord. Even Job experiences God's grace, of course, and he's called righteous Job in the New Testament.
Right.
But this idea that they're showing up remembering who they are, where they stand in this whole thing. And I think that's what you're saying, is that lest we forget, we're not owed forgiveness.
Right.
God doesn't owe us anything. We have what we have. with God by the grace, by His grace. And we would do well to remember that, because it reminds us that it reminds us where we come from. And I think for me, it helps me to keep a right attitude towards other people.
Yes, 100%. I think that's one of the things Paul drives home in that last point, is like, man, we're going to remember who we are. And it's interesting he's writing this to Ephesians, because I think that's in Revelation, the church in Ephesus is remember your first love.
Yeah.
And the idea is like, don't forget that you were outside.
Love it.
You were outside the covenant. You were at one point lost. Like, man, the opportunity
don't take
we
it for
have,
granted.
don't take it for
just
granted.
like, oh this is just how it goes. This is just how God is.
And
like,
don't
wait a minute.
look down your nose at the people that are moving towards Jesus. They've done a lot more with where they started from than you realize. They're moving towards Him nonetheless.
It's like Christmas morning with your kids, especially when they're younger, as they're just tearing into presents. And it's only my kids, they have to be trained. They don't stop. Most don't stop and say, thank you. It's just an assumption that this is mine and you should do this for me.
Yeah.
And it's like, hey, wait a minute. Don't forget, like, there's a cost.
Yeah.
Nothing is more pleasing, I think, to a mother or to a father than to have a son or a daughter come over and recognize the kindness and the gift.
Right.
Is something that takes real perspective and maturity that we don't always have.
Yeah, later on in life, when you get older, you look back, and especially not having kids, it's like, oh man, you realize how good parents you had, or like, it's just, you realize the decisions that were made, and there's a gratefulness.
A gratitude, sure. All right, well, Naomi's trust, Ruth's initiative, and God's grace. Beautiful sermon. I think it helped a lot of people this weekend.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to preach it. It was fun.